What happens when a government decides how many children you can have? What happens when that decision is forced upon every family in a nation, and the consequences ripple through generations, leaving scars that are invisible to the world? This is the untold story of China's one-child policy. Enacted in 1979, the one-child policy was introduced as a solution to China's rapidly growing population. What began as a measure to control the country's growth became a law that shaped the very lives of millions. But the policy's true cost has been buried, until now. Today, as China moves past this policy, the consequences are still being felt, and not just by the families who were forced to abide by it. The hidden victims of this law remain largely unseen. The children who were abandoned, the women whose rights were stripped, and the families broken by a law that dictated the most personal of decisions. Li Mei is just one of many who were forced into silence. She was made to make a choice no mother should ever have to make. The consequences of her decision would haunt her forever. And hers is not the only story. Thousands, millions, still live with the trauma, the heartbreak, and the loss caused by this policy. This documentary will take you into the lives of those affected, those who were forced to live in the shadows of a law that controlled their most personal rights. These are the stories that China tried to bury. But today, we bring them to light. Behind the policy's facade of population control lies a darker truth, a truth that still haunts the country and its people. This is the story of the hidden victims of China's one-child policy. While China's one-child policy was sold to the public as a necessary solution to control the population, its enforcement unleashed a wave of human rights violations, shattering the lives of millions. Forced abortions, sterilizations, and in some cases, human trafficking. These were not just statistics, they were real people, real lives lost, all in the name of government control. For women like Li Mei, the policy wasn't just a law, it was a sentence. In 1983, Li Mei found herself being forced to abort her third child, a decision she had no say in. The government's grip was suffocating, and for many, the violation of their bodies was just the beginning. I begged them to let me keep my baby, Li Mei recalls. But they told me it was the law. I had no choice. For millions of women, there was no choice. The government's policy was clear: one child, and one child only. Resistance was met with punishment, and often, with violence. For those who dared to resist or had already reached the one-child limit, the consequences were brutal. Forced sterilizations became common practice. Women's bodies were no longer their own. This wasn't just a law, it was an invasion of their most basic human rights. Families that defied the policy were not only fined or punished, their children were forcibly removed. Parents who wanted more than one child had their hopes crushed, and some were forced to abandon their newborns. The policy's dark underbelly was most devastating for young girls. In a country where sons were preferred, many girls were left to die, abandoned at birth, or placed in overcrowded orphanages. Some officials who once enforced the policy are now speaking out about the horrors they witnessed. One former official, who worked in rural regions, tells us, "It was a system built on fear and control. We were told to do whatever it took to make sure families complied, no matter the cost." And while the policy led to severe psychological and emotional tolls, it also gave rise to an even darker industry: human trafficking. The gender imbalance caused by the policy, millions of missing girls, created an underground network where women were trafficked and sold, often across borders. One survivor remembers being sold into marriage at just 14, taken to a foreign country where she had no rights, no voice. Her story is just one of many. Thousands of women and girls, victims of the one-child policy, disappeared into the shadows of human trafficking. Their names were forgotten, their lives erased, as they were sold to the highest bidder. Today, the world is still grappling with the aftermath. Human rights organizations continue to fight for the victims of China's one-child policy, pushing for acknowledgement, reparations, and justice. The scars of this policy will take generations to heal. As China continues to move forward, the memories of those who suffered under this policy must never fade. This is not just a story of the past. It is a call to remember, to seek justice, and to ensure that such violations of human rights never happen again. While the one-child policy was designed to control China's population, it set in motion a demographic shift of catastrophic proportions. The policy's effects can be seen today in the country's gender imbalance, the aging population, and the emerging 4-to-1 family structure. Over the course of 3 decades, the one-child policy led to an unprecedented gender imbalance. In 2015, it was estimated that there were nearly 30 million more men than women in China. A staggering number, one that set the stage for a host of social problems, including skyrocketing rates of loneliness, crime, and human trafficking. With fewer women available to marry, men, particularly those in rural areas, have faced significant social struggles. Desperation led many to turn to the black market, where human trafficking flourished. Thousands of women were kidnapped, sold into forced marriages, and trafficked across borders, all because there weren't enough women to go around. At the same time, the one-child policy led to another looming crisis: an aging population. China now faces a rapidly increasing elderly demographic, with fewer young people to support them. By 2025, it's projected that nearly 30% of China's population will be over the age of 60, a statistic that highlights the imbalance caused by decades of strict population control. Perhaps the most profound consequence of the one-child policy is what's known as the 4-to-1 problem: 1 child, 2 parents, and 4 grandparents. This demographic burden places an immense strain on the younger generation, who are expected to care for an increasingly aging population with fewer siblings to share the load. For many only children, this responsibility has been overwhelming. With no siblings to rely on, they are the sole caretakers of aging parents and, in some cases, their grandparents. The emotional and financial toll is staggering, leaving many young people with no time to build their own families or lives. As China's workforce shrinks and the demands on the younger generation grow, this demographic shift has had serious economic consequences. The strain on workers, coupled with a smaller pool of young people, threatens to destabilize the country's economy in the coming decades. Experts predict that China's economy will face serious challenges as the labor force shrinks and the elderly population continues to grow. The 4-to-1 structure not only affects families on a personal level, but also poses a significant social and economic dilemma for a nation already grappling with inequality and an aging infrastructure. The long-term implications of the one-child policy are undeniable. As China faces these challenges head-on, the question remains: how will a nation with millions of missing women, a shrinking workforce, and an aging population adapt to the reality of its past choices? In the late 1970s, China was at a crossroads. The nation had emerged from the tumultuous years of the Cultural Revolution, and its leaders faced an unprecedented challenge: how to manage a rapidly growing population and sustain economic progress in a country still recovering from decades of chaos. Enter Deng Xiaoping. In 1979, Deng took the helm of the Chinese government, determined to bring economic stability to the nation. Amid his reforms, one decision would shape the country's future for decades: the implementation of the one-child policy. The policy was introduced as a response to China's skyrocketing birth rates. By the late 1970s, China's population had surpassed 1 billion, with rapid growth putting immense strain on resources and social services. In a bid to curb this, the government introduced strict measures, including forced sterilizations, abortions, and fines for families that defied the law. Government propaganda framed the policy as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good, emphasizing the economic and environmental benefits of population control. Yet, few understood the toll it would take on the very fabric of Chinese society. The policy's reach was not only widespread but also unrelenting, causing devastation for countless families who had no choice but to comply. As the policy was enforced across China, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Forced abortions became a common practice, and women were coerced into sterilizations. Entire families were torn apart by the government's grip on reproductive rights. Yet, the state's justification for these actions remained unwavering: the law was for the collective good of the nation. But as the years passed, the policy's devastating impact became clear. In the 1990s, international human rights organizations began to scrutinize China's birth control practices. Protests from within the country grew, as many Chinese citizens felt the crushing weight of this population control strategy. Yet, the government's response remained firm for decades. It wasn't until 2016, after nearly 40 years of strict enforcement, that China officially ended the one-child policy. Faced with the consequences of a rapidly aging population and a shrinking workforce, the government finally lifted the restrictions, allowing families to have 2 children. But the damage had already been done. The scars of the policy would continue to affect Chinese society for generations. While the government celebrated the change in policy, the reality was far more complicated. The long-term effects, the broken families, the emotional scars, the unbalanced gender ratios, would take decades to repair, and many of those affected by the policy would never see the justice they deserve. The one-child policy is now a chapter in China's past, but its legacy is far from over. As the country moves forward, it must come to terms with the cost of its past decisions and the hidden victims whose lives were forever changed by a policy that controlled their most basic human rights. While the one-child policy controlled population growth, it also reshaped the very soul of a generation. Those who grew up under its shadow, the only children, carried a unique kind of loneliness, pressure, and expectation that no one had prepared them for. With one child per family, affection and ambition became concentrated. Parents poured their entire hope, wealth, and legacy into one life. The children of this era were nicknamed Little Emperors, pampered, protected, but also burdened with impossible expectations. To succeed was not a choice. It was a duty. Zhang Wei was born in 1988, one of millions raised as an only child. Growing up, he was surrounded by love, but also by pressure. "My parents told me every day," he recalls, "you carry the future of this family on your shoulders. If I failed, it wasn't just my failure, it was the failure of generations." For many like Zhang, the weight of expectation became a silent burden. Without siblings to share the emotional load, failure felt catastrophic. Their parents' dreams, their grandparents' hopes, all rested on one child. And for some, that weight became unbearable. For the parents, the psychological scars ran even deeper. Li Mei, who was once forced to abort her second child, still struggles with guilt and grief. "I told my son he must do well," she says softly. "He must live for the brother or sister he never had." For families like hers, love became entangled with loss. As this generation came of age, their loneliness evolved. Many of China's only children, now adults, describe an ache, a sense of disconnection in a country of 1.4 billion. Growing up without siblings shaped how they formed relationships, how they loved, and even how they faced loss. For many, grief was something they bore alone. Psychologists across China began to notice the long-term effects. Reports showed rising rates of anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal among the one-child generation. For the first time, the emotional cost of the policy was being measured, and it was staggering. Vong says he often wonders what life would have been like with a brother or sister. Someone to share secrets with. Someone to fight with. Someone who understands what it's like to be the only one. He pauses, watching the children run by. Sometimes, I feel like the loneliest person in a crowd. For Li Mei, the ache never fades. Her son's success brings her joy, but the shadow of what was lost lingers. Every birthday, every family photo, a reminder of the life that never was. Behind every statistic lies a story. Behind every family, a silent wound. The one-child policy didn't just reshape a nation, it reshaped the human heart. While the one-child policy reshaped China's demographic landscape, its influence ran deeper, touching the very core of Chinese culture. It changed how people viewed family, children, and gender, with effects that would echo for generations. Before the policy, Chinese families were large and multi-generational. Children were seen as a blessing, the future of the family and the country. But under the one-child policy, that view was flipped. Children were no longer seen as part of a larger whole. They became the singular focus of their parents' hopes, dreams, and sometimes, their very survival. The little emperors of China were raised to be perfect, the only ones. Every achievement, every failure, fell squarely on their shoulders. Without siblings, the sense of community within the family shifted dramatically. This change didn't just affect the children, but also how parents interacted with their only child. As families shrank, so did the traditional idea of care and companionship. Aging parents, once supported by large families, now faced the reality of relying on a single child, often without the support of siblings. The familial bonds that once defined Chinese society were fraying, leaving behind feelings of isolation and neglect. The policy didn't just affect individual families, it fundamentally reshaped China's cultural values. The emphasis on one child led to a shift in priorities, where personal achievement often eclipsed family and community. Gender roles, too, were deeply affected. The policy's preference for sons over daughters only intensified the societal pressure on women, reinforcing patriarchal views that had long been entrenched in Chinese culture. Girls, already seen as lesser in the eyes of many families, were now seen as even more expendable. The preference for male children only strengthened gender biases and placed immense pressure on women, who were expected to uphold the family name but with far fewer rights. Today, China is grappling with the consequences of its past. While the one-child policy officially ended in 2016, its effects continue to shape the national psyche. Families still prioritize academic success, often at the expense of emotional well-being. But perhaps the most profound impact is on the social fabric of the nation. Families are smaller, and the weight of responsibility often falls on a single child, forcing them to navigate an intensely competitive world alone. For women like Lu Fong, now in her 30s, the one-child policy is still a haunting memory. I was expected to be everything for my parents, their pride, their hope. There was no room for failure, she says. It's a burden that never truly leaves you. As more and more of China's only children reach adulthood, they are beginning to open up about their experiences. In a country where silence has often been the norm, these young people are now speaking out, challenging the generational expectations that once dictated every aspect of their lives. The story of the one-child policy is not just about politics or population control. It's a story about how a nation's choice reshaped its culture, its families, and the very way its people view each other. The emotional scars are still there, but as time passes, the next generation is starting to find its voice. And in that, there may be hope for healing. The one-child policy may have officially ended in 2016, but the scars of its implementation are far from healed. Today, China is grappling with the consequences of this policy, a nation dealing with a shrinking workforce, an aging population, and social dynamics that have been irrevocably altered. China's population continues to age, and the 4-to-1 dilemma still weighs heavily on families. In 2025, over 30% of China's population is expected to be over 60 years old. But even more striking, the children of this generation, raised with the emotional scars of being the only ones, are now parents themselves, raising children in an environment deeply shaped by their past. So, how does a country move forward when its past continues to haunt it? The answer isn't simple, and the emotional cost isn't just monetary. It's felt in the quiet moments between parents and children, in the weight of unspoken expectations, and in the lives of those who never had a chance to grow up with siblings. So ask yourself, how would you feel if the government decided how many children you could have? Would you feel the weight of that decision? Would you wonder if your life, your freedom, was just another calculation in the eyes of a government far removed from your reality? What does this mean for family, for freedom, and for human rights? We want to hear from you. What do you think? How would you react if your personal choices were taken away? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to start a conversation about this topic, about the lessons learned, and about the struggles of those who lived through this policy. Tell us your story. If you've been affected by population control laws, or if you know someone who has, share your experiences. Your voice matters, and it's time these hidden victims are finally heard. For more stories like this, dive deeper into the broader issues of human rights, population control, and family rights. Check out our other videos and subscribe to stay informed. Let's continue this conversation, and let's make sure the voices of the forgotten are heard. Join the movement, share your story, and help shape a future where no one is left behind. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can ensure that these stories are never forgotten.